When we're about to give a speech or presentation, we might be thinking a lot about things like our body language, our tonality, the content of our speech. But one thing that I've been guilty of forgetting, and I've seen a lot of people not pay attention to, is actually understanding who the audience really is. And the same speech delivered to two different audiences can have vastly different results. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. What are the important things that we need to know about our audience even before we start to craft our speech? And how do we really go about getting to know that information? Hey, my name is Radeep, and I'm the founder of Frantically Speaking, and I love learning about effective communications and sharing those learnings with you so that you can level up your communications game as well. So we're going to break this down into two parts. We're going to start by talking about what are the important things we need to know about the audience, and secondly, how to go about getting that information. So starting with what we need to know, there are four things over here. First, we're going to start off with the basics. These are things that we definitely should know about the people we're about to speak to. This includes things like the size of the audience, the average age, the gender, the occupation. These are basic things that if we don't know or if we are wrong on, the entire speech can be skewed completely differently. For example, if the audience is going to be of a smaller size, the level of interactive elements that you can add here can be so much more intimate as opposed to something with a larger audience where it has to be a lot more structured and a lot more formal maybe. If the audience is skewed towards a particular age or gender, we need to have our content catering towards them. If you have an audience which has both the age groups within one particular crowd itself, the content needs to be wide enough to be inclusive enough to have both the age groups understand what you're trying to say. So the type of pop culture references you might be using, the type of slides you might be showing, the type of language you use, it all comes down to what the audience can really resonate with. And if you have a very diverse audience sitting in front of you, it can be kind of tricky to include all the elements that can appeal to both these different age groups. So knowing this information will give you the direction you need to take to craft the basic content and tonality of your speech. The next thing to take into account, and which is the most important thing, is the context. What I mean by this, that is your speech, the place you're speaking in, is it a corporate setting, is it a formal setting, is it a wedding toast, is it an informal party, is it a Toastmaster speech, is it a contest, a conference? What is the context that you're speaking in, and what type of tone do you need to address this particular audience with? Sorry, the light went off. And understanding this this is the kind of crux that we need to know to craft our tonality around. And by tonality, I don't mean our voice modulation, but the overall tone of our speech. Because I've done this once wherein I had to speak at a very formal corporate event, and I was just using very humorous language, very informal words, and it just did not vibe with the audience. The entire setting was very formal and poised, and I was just coming around and goofing about on stage, which did not go well with the crowd. And on the other hand, when I was in college, I was a lot more formal, I was a lot more tight on stage, whereas a humorous tonality or an entertaining personality would have just been so much better, which it would have just resonated so much better with a younger crowd, like a college crowd. So understanding the context of your audience, the setting of where you're really speaking at is very important to understand the entire tone of your speech. One more thing to keep into account here is that while understanding context, we need to know whether the people you're addressing, are they there voluntarily or are they required to be there? If they're there voluntarily, you've won half the battle already. They're most likely already interested in what you have to say. They're interested in you as a speaker and the thing that you're about to speak about. But if they're required to sit there, then they probably already dislike you even before you get on stage. Right out of college, I was doing this small sales gig and I had to address college students, and the teacher would kind of make them wait back right before their break and give me a few minutes to speak to them. And of course, they did not want to sit there. They would rather go for their break than really talk to some sales guy, pitch some kind of product or service to them. So knowing that information that they were there, they were kind of forced to sit there, it helped me craft the context of my speech to at least get some of their attention or some of their empathy to listen to me. So I would start the speech, I would start my pitch by saying that, hey guys, I know that you're kind of forced to sit here and you'd rather be in your break than listen to hear me talk. But if you just give me a few minutes of your time, I'm sure I can add some value to you. And this would win over at least a few of them, or at least it would make them slightly more patient to sit and hear me talk for a few minutes. So understanding context, prime importance. The next thing that we want to know is the knowledge of the audience. Whatever subject we're speaking on, is the audience fairly new to that, or do they have a fair amount of understanding of whatever the subject is? If they're fairly new to it, your content needs to be a lot more broader. You have to cover a lot more foundational elements. Your tone needs to be a lot friendlier and encouraging. Whereas if they are a lot more advanced in terms of knowledge, you can use a lot more jargon. You can be a lot more technical. You can be slightly harsher with the audience by expecting them to know certain things. And the level that you're interacting with them on, the type of questions you're asking them, your entire content and delivery can be a lot faster and a lot heavier in terms of the information you're providing. So understanding knowledge will just help you get the sense of how to craft your speech in terms of keeping it more advanced or keeping it more fundamental. And the fourth and last thing that we need to know about the audience is their mood. Now, I've ignored this so many times and it's just never worked out well. Even if we know our speech, even if our material is top notch, and even if the audience wants to listen to you and wants to be there for your speech, if your speech is after a lunch break, or if you're the last speaker in a 4-hour event, the audience obviously just doesn't have the capacity to listen to you or to learn more. By that time, they probably just want to go home. So so understanding this mood is very important, to know when you are going to be speaking to the audience, at what time of day, what number of speaker you are, how into the event the audience will be, when you are supposed to go on the stage is extremely important. Because if you're supposed to go on stage at a time when you know the audience is not very primed, is not very enthusiastic, try and cut your speech a little shorter. Even though you're allotted maybe 20 minutes or 1 hour to speak, having fewer points to talk about or concising your material, try to make it slightly more fun and interactive. Even if you're not probably fully prepared for that or didn't account for it before, adding those elements in, cutting something short will just help in that situation, because the audience is just not going to be able to absorb that much information at that moment. So understanding the mood of your audience, very important. You might have to make some last minute changes if you don't know this already, if you don't know when you're going to be really talking to them. So try and get that information early on. So if they are going to be at a stage where they're not going to be able to pay that much attention, you know how much material to cut down, what type of things to add in your speech, to take out, and whatnot. Okay, so those are the 4 things that we need to know about our audience. Now let's talk about 4 things that we can do to really get this information. The first go-to thing that I always try is to contact the host of the venue, or whoever, or the person who's invited me for the speech, presentation, pitch, or whatever it might be. They usually they might be the coordinators of the particular event, and they probably would be having a good understanding of at least the basics of the audience. So things like their age, size, occupation, level of knowledge and experience. This type of information is probably fairly easy to get from the person who's hosting, who's the host of the venue, or the person who's invited you for that particular event. One thing to add over here is that if you do have access to this person, and if they allow you to access the database of the audience, so the email IDs or phone numbers, you can even send out a small survey to the audience to understand a few nuances that you might need to know before you actually craft your speech. If they're unwilling to give you the data, you can request them to pass on the survey to the people who are going to be present for the event. But this is kind of like a 50-50 thing. It really depends on the relationship with the host. It depends on how willing they are to really do this for you, because it will require a little bit of extra effort on their part. So if that is a possibility, and if you do need that extra information, then a survey is something that you can try as well. Another important thing to ask the host is to know that, especially if you're giving a speech in a different country or a locality that you're not familiar with, is to understand, are there any biases that the audience hold? Are there any beliefs or anything that you should probably stay away from talking about when you're addressing that audience, that you should be aware about? Knowing this is very important, especially if you're not aware of the culture that of the culture of the audience whom you're going to be addressing. Because certain things might be considered offensive some places. while they might be colloquial or normal language to you. So knowing those things would be fairly important, especially if you're completely unfamiliar with that place's culture. If the host is not accessible to you, another way to get some information about the audience is to use LinkedIn. This LinkedIn has come to my aid a lot, especially for pitch presentations. When I have to be pitching to a boardroom of about 10 to 15 people, to go to people's LinkedIn profiles and understand what their experience and job history is, it helps me know what type of things do I need to include in my presentation. Do I need to make it a lot more foundational? Are the people fairly experienced enough that I can just jump straight to the point? Is there a mix of both crowds? What's the median age group? These things will help me kind of just craft my presentation a little better. If you're speaking to a very large crowd, LinkedIn might not be the best option, although you can try and identify some key people within the audience and at least get their background information so you have somewhat of an understanding of who you're speaking to. If the internet isn't cutting it for you or the venue host is not available, the best thing to do is to arrive early and greet the audience that's attending that particular event. Now, this might be a little last minute thing to do, but it'll at least help us give some understanding about things like what their educational background is, what the average occupation is, age group and gender and things along those lines. By this time, you probably already have a fair understanding of the context you're in and what time of the day you're going to be delivering your speech so that you can predict the mood of the audience. So that information is already there. This is mainly done to get those slightly more basic things in place so that if you think that if there are some aspects of your speech that are not relating to this audience, you can quickly go around and tweak those things. And if none of these things work for whatever reason, there's a technique that you can use, which I learned in Toastmasters, but I've also seen one of my favorite people use it. His name is Gary Vaynerchuk, and I'm sure you've heard of him as well. And he uses this technique called the call and response. Early on in his career, when he would go around speaking at events, he would ask the audience at the very beginning how many of them have never heard of him. And almost more than, I think, 50% of the audience would raise their hands. And this would give him an understanding of how much context he needs to set about himself before diving into the actual informational points that the audience was actually there for. So if more than 50% of the people didn't know about him, he would start by talking about his backstory, who he is, why is he an authority in the space, and why people should really listen to him. So having this call and response technique is slightly advanced, and you might be required to make a few tweaks in your speech or presentation as you go along on the spot as well, depending on what the audience is responding with. But if you really have no understanding of certain things you need to know, then this is the last resort that you can use as well. And that's about it. 4 things that we need to know about our audience and 4 ways to try and get to know those things. If you have any more questions with regard to things like public speaking, communications, or anything along those lines, we have an entire website with a bunch of resources and in-depth articles dedicated just for that. So go check out franticallyspeaking.com.